opened in 1925 as a home for the mentally challenged. It's owned by the District of Columbia, and at the time it wanted to be they wanted a facility that was far away from everywhere. They didn't quite know how to handle at the time what they called them feeble-minded. They didn't quite know how to handle them, so they wanted them far away, but it was called a farm cottage at the time. So they had a working farm on site, and this area back then was very remote, and it took a long time to get to. They started building in 1925 under the guidance of their first superintendent was a guy named Dr. Kenneth Jones, and under his guidance they built building after building, and eventually it went from, they only had 20 or 30 people there, to the 60s and 70s where there was 1,500 residents. And the problem was, though, there was never enough staff for the amount of people that they had there. The initial idea of a farm cottage was that there was a working farm and it was going to be self-sustainable. They had their own water tower, they had their own food supply, they wouldn't need any kind of outside help. Well, as they got more and more people, the farm could no longer support that, and then they no longer had the right amount of staff. So, the patients started getting neglected, and a lot of people were just sent to what at the time was called the district training school. They were sent there not because they were mentally challenged, they were just sent there because the district didn't have anything else to do with them. So you had deaf people being sent there, mentally challenged people being sent there, delinquents being sent there, all put together in the same spaces, same areas, and overcrowding took over, and there were a lot of deaths, a lot of deaths that could have been avoided had the staff properly been supervising. Well, once I came the first time initially, I didn't really know much about the place, and then it intrigued me, because rarely in these types of abandoned places do you see everything's just left behind, and usually they're cleaned out pretty good and they're just kind of shells of buildings, and they can have some broken windows and graffiti, but there's nothing really left. Well, when I came to Forest Haven, that was just not the case. Everything literally, it's like they closed the doors one day and left. I mean, desks and papers and stuff everywhere, and at that time there was very little graffiti. A lot of people didn't know about the place, so vandals hadn't come in and destroyed it and all that. So that intrigued me, so then I started researching it, and it kind of became like a hobby / passion, was researching Forest Haven, and went down and did some research at the DC archives to find just pretty much anything I could. Vintage photographs of the facility when it was open, old news clips of it, old news articles of it. So the first one is Hemlock Cottage, and that kept the worst of the worst offenders for a while. It had some isolation rooms and things like that, and it was off the beaten path from the rest of the facility, and that's for a reason. And from there we went to I believe the basement of the laundry building, and in the laundry building it's what it sounds like. It's a laundry building, and they also made clothing there, and any kind of blankets and things like that. They'd have big printing presses and silk screens and things like that. And from there we went to Pine Cottage, and Pine Cottage is one of 4 cottages that typically house the residents. There's recreation areas in the basement, and then the upper floors, they usually had beds on either side, and then some kind of mess hall in the middle. From there we went to Magnolia Cottage, which is one of the really old buildings. That was also a residence, but Magnolia Cottage has been there since the 20s. It's one of the original buildings, and that's pretty beat up and run down, and it was a pretty bad area. From there we went to the administration building. The administration building was built in the 30s, and then a floor was added in the 50s, I believe, and that was just where all the staff resided. It's where the superintendent's office was. It was where the secretaries were and things like that. The basement housed the morgue. The dentist's office and doctors were in there. They called it the hospital building for a while. From there we went across. We went to where did we go from there? We went to Morse Cottage. Morse Cottage was built a little later, and it was originally for small children and the infants and things like that. And that was before the Elliott Nursery was made, and that was the last stop we went. Martha Elliott Nursery, and that was for infants and things like that. And it was more of an open air design to where ambulatory patients could breathe fresh air while they were there, almost kind of like a tuberculosis hospital from back in the day. In 1976, there was a lawsuit brought against the District of Columbia by the parents of a girl named Joy Evans. Joy was a resident at Forest Haven. It had changed its name in the 50s from District Training School to Forest Haven. It gave it, I guess, a nicer ring. So what had happened with her was she was severely mentally challenged, and she got what's called aspiration pneumonia, which was from being fed lying down. And you know, they tend to breathe in some of their food, and she ended up dying. So the parents brought suit against the District of Columbia in 1976, and it took several years, but it was eventually decided that Forest Haven needed to close, and it took until October of 1991 before the facility actually shut down. It was a terrible, terrible place. Lots of people suffered there. I don't know that you should preserve places like that necessarily. I mean, it caused people nothing but pain for 70 some odd years, and you know, I don't know if we should preserve places like that. I mean, you know, it's the buildings themselves, some of them aren't even structurally historically relevant. You know, they look like a lot of buildings built at that time. There's nothing really too special about them. So I know that that Forest Haven was put on the put up application for being on the historic register, but it was denied, and you know, they didn't find any reason to do that. So I don't know if it should be or not.